She smiled on stage, lifted the microphone, and announced the divorce right in front of everyone. The entire hall froze. Evan Cross stood there beneath the glittering lights, and unfinished music turned into a defeated man by a single sentence. But that was only what they thought. The anniversary gala of Aurora Grid was supposed to be a celebration. Crystal glasses caught the light like artificial stars. Laughter drifted through the grand ballroom of the hotel overlooking Seattle Bay, where the ocean wind was cold, but no one seemed to notice. People came to honor success, to display connections, to witness expensive handshakes, and to watch Evan Cross, the quietest man in the room, standing beside his beautiful wife like a shadow. Evan was not the kind of man who drew attention. His suit fit perfectly, but never tried to impress. He stood straight hands, loosely folded eyes, calm, scanning the crowd as if reading an invisible balance sheet. Many guests thought he was lucky. They believed he had married the perfect woman, a queen of public relations whose smile could command a room. They saw him as dull, obsessed with numbers living in her glow. Sloane Cross was the opposite. She moved as if the red carpet had been laid just for her. The silver silk dress clung to her body, every step calculated to draw eyes. She laughed loudly, and often laughing as though the room existed for her alone. When she stepped onto the stage, applause rose naturally, almost instinctively. Sloane knew how to make people listen. She lived on that power. Damien Vale stood near the stage, a glass of wine in his hand, his gaze sharp and confident. He was the guest of honor, a famous investor known for ruthless takeovers. When Sloane glanced down at the audience, her eyes passed over Evan and lingered on Damien for just a moment longer. Only a moment, but enough for a few perceptive guests to feel something slip out of alignment. Sloane began her speech, sweetly recounting the company's journey, the sleepless nights, the passion and sacrifice. Evan listened, nodding at the right moments, as if this were just another familiar report. Inside, however, everything had already been marked. He knew this moment would come. He just had not known how large a stage she would choose. Then Sloane stopped. She took a slow breath, and the smile on her lips shifted. It lost its warmth, its friendliness becoming sharp, like a freshly honed blade. Some truths cannot stay hidden forever, she said. Some relationships have expired. She turned and looked straight at Evan. Her eyes were no longer those of a wife, but of a prosecutor reading an indictment. "I am divorcing you." A wave of whispers swept the room. Mouths fell open. Heads turned. Pity flickered in several eyes as they looked at Evan, as if he had just been pushed off a cliff in front of hundreds of witnesses. Evan did not move. He did not lower his head or step back. He stood still, feeling the chill of the room, feeling the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. He looked at Sloane, then at Damien, who allowed himself a faint, victorious smile, like a man who had just won a bet. In Sloane's mind, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Evan would be confused, would protest, or would collapse into silent humiliation. She would become the brave woman leaving a suffocating marriage. Damien would be there waiting, powerful and triumphant. But in Evan's mind, a different map was opening. Paths of money signatures, transfers hidden in darkness. He remembered the nights alone in front of glowing screens when the world assumed he was not paying attention. He remembered the cold tightening in his chest as the pieces locked together. He took a slow sip of water and set the glass down carefully. A small gesture, but enough to make Damien hesitate, enough to make Sloane feel that something was wrong. Evan stepped forward, unhurried, deliberate. The lights caught his face, and for the first time that night, people truly looked at him. "Some parties are held to celebrate," Evan said, his voice low and steady. "And some parties exist only to end a performance." He paused, letting the silence spread like oil on water. "And this," he continued, is the second kind. A shiver ran through part of the crowd. Sloane tightened her grip on the microphone. Damien narrowed his eyes. None of them understood that in this exact moment, the real power in the room had quietly changed hands. It all began with a number that should never have existed. A sum of money slipped away in silence, cold and precise enough to kill a marriage without the need for an affair. 10 weeks before the gala night, Evan Cross sat alone in his home office overlooking the bay. Seattle rain fell steadily, thin and relentless, stretching time until it felt endless. Blue light from 3 monitors reflected off his face, highlighting the calm features of a man accustomed to living inside data. This was not work hours. This was ritual. Once a month, Evan reviewed every household expense not out of suspicion, but out of order. To him, money was like blood. It had to flow through the right vessels for the body to stay alive. Normally, everything balanced. Sloane's spending was high, but consistent. Fashion events, charity image. It was the operating cost of a woman who lived under public scrutiny. Evan understood that. He had never complained. But that night when the cursor lingered too long on a single line, a chill ran down his spine. A transfer worth $50,000 had gone out 2 days earlier. The beneficiary was a company he had never heard of. The name sounded clean and professional, like hundreds of consulting firms that existed solely to conceal something dirtier underneath. Evan frowned. He knew every contractor in their home, every event agency Sloane worked with. This name lived in none of his memories. He typed it into the state business registry. No results. He tried another state. Then it appeared. A company incorporated less than a month ago, registered to a generic office address, the kind used to hide real owners. Evan leaned back in his chair. The feeling was not pain. It was a muted impact, like realizing the floor beneath your feet had quietly cracked. The office door opened softly. Sloane stepped in just back from a fundraising event. Her dress still carried the scent of expensive perfume, her face flawless, as if carefully reset into place. She asked why he was still awake, her tone distant, but gentle enough to avoid suspicion. Evan did not minimize the screen. He watched her reflection in the dark glass, tracking every subtle movement. He asked about the transfer casually, as if checking cash flow. Sloane did not look at the monitor. She answered quickly and smoothly, saying it was for an upcoming media project. Her voice did not shake, but her shoulders stiffened for a fraction of a second, too brief for anyone else to notice. Evan did. He lived off smaller deviations than that. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a light rehearsed touch, and told him to sleep early since he had a board meeting in the morning. When she left, the sound of her heels faded down the long hallway. Evan remained still. $50,000 was not the issue. Secrecy was. Money that hides always carries intent. He opened a new spreadsheet. He did not name it divorce. He did not name it betrayal. He named it North Star, a fixed point to navigate by once everything began to spin. He scrolled backward in time, searching for smaller amounts test transactions. He reviewed credit cards, invoices, expenses, split just enough to avoid attention. Every number became a footprint, and none of them led home. A cold realization formed in Evan's mind. The emotional distance of the past year was not marital fatigue. It was strategy. Sloane was not drifting away from him. She was digging a tunnel, and she was using his money to buy the shovel. Elsewhere in the house, Sloane lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She believed she had hidden it well enough. She believed Evan was too busy, too dry, too slow to notice. In her mind, he was a safe man, predictable, incapable of imagining he was being outplayed. She did not know that in the next room that man had just stopped being a husband. He had become an auditor. And when Evan finally shut down the computer, the room fell into silence. No anger, no heartbreak, just a decision made without sound. If the truth was being buried with money, then money would be the thing to expose it. He did not need to rush. The people who believe they are the smartest are always the ones who make the most catastrophic mistakes when they are convinced no one is watching. She was fired on a rainy afternoon after a meeting that lasted barely 10 minutes. No warning, no explanation. Just an envelope placed on the table and a cold look telling her to clear her desk immediately. Her name was Maya Lin, and before she became a risk that needed to be removed, she was the first person to see the truth. Maya worked in Aurora Grid's vendor analysis department. Her job was to read contracts, compare pricing, and trace irregularities. It was a low-level position rarely noticed, often dismissed as a minor cog in a massive machine. But Maya had a dangerous habit. She did not just look at numbers. She looked at the relationships between them. And one morning, while reviewing the vendor list for an expansion project, she realized something did not line up. 3 different suppliers, 3 different names, but the same billing address, the same legal representative, the same contract structure copied with surgical precision. Each contract was small enough on its own, divided just enough to avoid triggering internal alerts. But when Maya added them together, the picture changed. This was not error. It was intent. She reported it to her direct manager. At first they smiled and praised her attention to detail. Then questions were deflected. Emails went unanswered. 1 week later, her project was reassigned. 2 weeks later, her system access was restricted. 3 weeks later, she was called into a small conference room where human resources was already waiting. The reason written on the paper was restructuring. But the eyes of the person who signed the decision were not neutral. They carried a clear message. You have seen too much. Maya left the building with a box of personal belongings in her arms. Outside, Seattle rain poured down without mercy. She stood beneath the awning, shaking not only from the cold. She understood she had been punished, but what frightened her more was the truth she now carried. Those contracts were not just cost fraud. They were pipelines. Pipelines designed to move money out. Elsewhere in the city, Evan Cross was sitting in the office of an old friend, a lawyer who specialized in labor disputes. The meeting began as a casual favor and ended with a name, Maya Lin. Evan listened to her story through a voice that was exhausted yet steady. He recognized something familiar in her. Precision, the stubborn resolve of someone who believed numbers never lied. When Maya laid out copies of contracts and meticulously marked personal notes, Evan did not look surprised. He only felt another layer of fog being pulled away from the larger picture. The money he had been tracing was not disappearing. It was being routed through intermediary vendors, cleaned by signatures and stamps, then returned in another form. That was why the numbers always looked reasonable when viewed individually. That was why Sloane could answer every question so smoothly. She was not spending the money. She was distributing it. Maya expected Evan to explode or panic. Instead, he sat still, fingers interlaced, eyes dark and deep like still water. In his mind, the final pieces locked into place with a silent click. This was not just marital betrayal. This was an operation, and Sloane was not acting alone. He asked Maya a single question. Was she willing to step forward as a whistleblower? Maya stayed silent for a long time. She thought about her student loans, about the reputation that had just been stained, about how no company wanted to hire someone who had been fired under vague circumstances. Then she remembered being pushed out of that conference room, where the truth had been buried beneath polite language. She nodded. At home, Sloane felt control beginning to slip. She received a short message from an internal contact. People were asking about Maya. She frowned and forced herself to stay calm. In her mind, Maya was a small detail. Acceptable damage. She did not know that this very detail had just been placed in the hands of the man she underestimated most. Evan moved Maya out of public view, connected her with the right lawyers, people accustomed to working in the shadows of major cases. He made no promises of money, no promises of victory. He said only one thing: if the truth is deep enough, it will always find its way to the surface. When Maya left the office that night, she no longer felt alone, and Evan, standing by the window watching the city lights rise, knew he had gained something money could never buy: a witness, a small sharp blade ready to cut in exactly the right place. From that moment on, the game was no longer a secret. The envelope slid across the wooden table and stopped in front of Evan's hand like a challenge. Inside was not just paperwork. It was a map of a crime that was still breathing. The meeting took place in a private storage archive on the north side of the city, a place where old records were kept quieter than people. Cold fluorescent light washed over rows of metal cabinets, turning the room into something that felt like an operating theater. Evan Cross sat across from Noah Trent, a man whose name the financial world spoke only in whispers. Noah was a forensic accountant, someone who did not chase profit, but hunted the truth buried beneath it. Noah did not speak much. He opened the envelope and pulled out thick stacks of documents, laying them out in a precise line like chess pieces before a final match. Evan did not rush to touch them. He watched. The way Noah placed the pages, the way he paused at each one, deciding how much to reveal. This was not a presentation. It was a skinning. The pressure began with small details: intermediary vendors, split invoices, contracts so similar they felt unnatural. Noah traced the intersections with fingers hardened by years of turning paper. His voice was slow and even like reading medical results. The money did not disappear. It was guided, filtered, then returned in another form. Evan finally opened the file. The numbers did not shock him. He had prepared for them. What froze the air was the name at the end of a chain of authorizations. A familiar signature, bold, looping, arrogant. Damien Vale. In that instant, the story changed color. This was no longer a wife betraying a husband. This was a takeover, a rival using Evan's own money to pump life into his system. Sloane was not just having an affair. She was investing, and she believed she had chosen the winning side. Noah continued, his voice dropping lower. It was not just one channel. There were branches, shell companies tied to the same network of lawyers, payments for consulting services that did not exist, office leases under third-party names, a luxury sports car financed through intermediaries. Everything looked clean on the surface. Underneath it was connected like the roots of a poisonous tree. Evan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He did not feel jealousy. He did not feel humiliation. What rose instead was a different kind of rage, cold and sharp. In his mind, the image of Sloane smiling on the gala stage appeared, the smile of someone who believed she had already won. He understood the most important thing. She was not afraid of being discovered. She was only afraid of being discovered too early. Noah watched Evan closely, measuring his reaction. Most people would panic, would try to freeze. Everything would call lawyers and shut it down. Evan did not. He asked a single question. How much time? Noah answered. At least a few months. If they were allowed to continue, the network would expand. The trails would grow clearer. And then no one could claim this was an accident. This was intent. Evan nodded. A strategy formed in his mind. If Damien wanted to play with Evan's money, he would let him play. If Sloane believed she was digging her escape tunnel, Evan would let her dig deeper. Not because he was weak, but because he understood a simple truth. Greedy people leave the most evidence when they believe no one is watching. Elsewhere, Sloane stood in front of a mirror, adjusting her hair. She felt relieved. The money was moving as planned. Damien had reassured her that everything was under control. In her mind, Evan was still the same man, orderly, predictable, harmless. She did not know that in a room as cold as a morgue, her husband had just decided he was no longer trying to save the marriage. Evan left the archive after dark. The wind was strong, carrying the scent of salt and metal. He did not call a car right away. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, letting the wind cut across his skin like a ritual of purification. The 10-year marriage was dead, but something else had just been born. Clarity. He did not need to hurry. Every passing day, Damien would need more money. Sloan would transfer more. The shell companies would grow. And when the stage was large enough, when they stepped confidently into the light, Evan would only need to do one thing: turn on the lights. In the darkness of the city, a chessboard was being reset. And this time, the most underestimated man was the one controlling every square. The house still stood there, but the marriage no longer existed. Two people slept under the same roof and ate at the same table, yet every footstep echoed as if it crossed enemy territory. In the days following the meeting with Noah, Evan Cross began the most dangerous role of his life, the role of a husband who knew nothing, the role of a man everyone underestimated. Each morning he brewed coffee the way Sloan liked it, set the cup by the window, asked harmless questions about her schedule. His voice stayed, even his eyes, calm. Not a single crack revealed what was drilling deeper inside him. Sloan noticed the change, but she misread it completely. She thought Evan had given up. In her mind, his silence meant defeat. The man who once scrutinized every number no longer questioned anything. The man who demanded clarity now let her come and go as she pleased. That relief made her careless, and when people feel relieved, they begin to slip. Evan watched quietly. He memorized details he had once ignored. The way Sloan placed her phone face down on the table. The way she changed passwords late at night. The way she began wearing a perfume that did not belong to their shared past. It was not the scent of betrayal. It was the scent of confidence, the confidence of someone who believed they had escaped. One evening, Evan suggested dinner together. No gala, no friends. Just a small restaurant by the pier where the sound of waves softened the silences. Sloan looked surprised, then smiled. She thought this was him trying to hold on. She thought she was in control. Throughout the meal, Evan spoke little. He let Sloan talk. She spoke about work, about new projects, about powerful men she called partners. Each name landed like a small arrow, striking the empty space between them. Evan listened and nodded like a husband accepting a supporting role in his own life. Then he set the bait. He said the company was considering a strategic shift. He mentioned that his personal liquidity might be moved temporarily. He admitted he was tired and wanted things to be safer. The words were carefully arranged, weak enough to sound vulnerable, precise enough to awaken a predator's instinct. Sloan did not react immediately, but Evan saw her eyes brighten for the briefest moment, an unconscious signal. That night, when she believed he was asleep, Sloan texted in the dark. Evan did not need to see the screen to know the message. He knew she was reporting in, asking for direction. Somewhere else in the city, Damien Vale smiled as he read it. In his mind, Evan Cross had been properly categorized, a safe man, predictable, about to become a source of capital. Over the following days, Damien appeared more often in Sloan's stories, not as a lover, but as an advisor, someone who understood markets, someone who knew how to exploit weakness. Evan heard everything and recorded it all. He did not argue, did not show jealousy, did not ask questions. His calm convinced Sloan she had won the psychological game. That calm was the attack. In silence, Evan began adjusting small details. One account remained untouched as bait. One credit limit stayed unchanged to create comfort. A few carefully placed complaints were scattered to the right ears. He understood that greedy people do not need to be pushed. They only need to be reassured. Some nights Evan lay awake staring at the dark ceiling listening to Sloane's steady breathing beside him. In those moments, old emotions tried to surface memories of the early years of a woman who once smiled differently, who once held his hand without calculation. He allowed himself to feel the pain in silence, but only within limits. If the pain showed, the strategy would collapse. Sloane was different. She slept well. She dreamed of a new life where Evan was only a convenient past. In her dreams, Damien stood ahead, strong and generous. She did not see the wires tightening around her neck. She saw only freedom. Evan understood what she never would. The moment someone believes they control the game is the moment they reveal every card. And Evan was patiently waiting for that moment. The marriage had become a stage. Each passing day was another performance. And the most underestimated man in that house was the director, quietly setting the scene for an ending that could not be reversed. Evan stepped into the penthouse as if walking straight into enemy territory, while the man waiting inside believed himself the victor. No one in that glass-walled room understood that the prey had just entered the trap willingly. The evening unfolded high above the dark water, where city lights shattered like scattered coins. Damien Vale stood by the stone bar, slowly turning his glass, the familiar smile of a predator already in place. Sloane stood beside him, her fitted dress catching the light like a declaration. She introduced Evan to the others with polished courtesy, as if he were an accessory brought along out of obligation. Evan took everything in at his own pace. Italian furniture, abstract art worth a fortune, the heavy scent of men's cologne filling the air. Every detail was chosen to say one thing: power control, dominance. Damien loved displaying trophies, and tonight in his mind, the trophy was the man standing across from him. They sat. Drinks were poured. Small talk was tossed back and forth like bait. Damien spoke about volatile markets, about funds that required a firm hand to steer them. He glanced at Evan, measuring reactions, searching for cracks. Evan simply nodded, eyes tired, voice slower than usual. He let Damien believe he was witnessing weakness. Sloane joined in at the perfect moments. She touched Evan's arm with a rehearsed intimacy, then turned to Damien and mentioned that Evan was considering moving part of his personal funds to find safer ground. The way she framed it made it sound like a confession of defeat. Evan did not correct her. He let silence finish the sentence. Damien's lips curved upward. He spoke of opportunities only the bold could seize. He mentioned a new investment fund, a structure lean and flexible, discreet enough to avoid curious eyes. The words were wrapped in professionalism, but underneath was a naked invitation. "Give me your money." Evan leaned forward slightly, not much, just enough for Damien to see interest. He said he was tired of controlling every detail, that sometimes the safest move was letting someone else decide. The words landed like a key on the table. Damien heard the sound of a vault unlocking. In Damien's mind, the pieces aligned. Evan Cross, the cautious man, had finally cracked. He saw a steady flow of capital ahead, a complete victory. Not only taking his rival's wife, but using the rival's own money to strengthen his position. He raised his glass and lightly tapped it against Evan's, a silent ritual, sealing the moment. Sloane watched the two men. She saw Damien's confidence and Evan's quiet demeanor. A sweet sense of triumph rose in her chest. She believed she had chosen correctly. Strength and weakness now seemed clear. Evan felt something very different. His heartbeat stayed even. He noticed how Damien talked more once he believed he held the advantage. He noticed how Sloane no longer bothered hiding her complicity. In that moment, Evan knew he had what he needed. Not a signature, not a contract, but arrogance. When the evening ended, Damien walked them to the door with an even broader smile. He said he would send a detailed proposal within days. Evan nodded, shook his hand, kept his gaze lowered. A handshake held just long enough for Damien to believe he had won. Inside the elevator, Sloane leaned against the mirrored wall, adjusting her lipstick. She asked Evan if he felt lighter. Evan said yes. The answer was honest enough that she did not question it. She did not know that the relief was not from being saved, but from the trap snapping shut. When the elevator doors opened, Evan stepped out first, holding the door for his wife. He looked straight ahead at the lobby lights reflecting off his calm face. He had just done the most dangerous thing possible. He had invited the thief into the vault and handed over a false key. High above, Damien returned to the bar and poured another drink. He thought about the incoming capital, about power expanding. He did not realize that from the moment Evan stepped into that room, the rules of the game had changed. And the man who believed himself the hunter had just exposed his throat to the most underestimated man in the room. The call came close to midnight, and a single sentence was enough to flip the entire board. It did not come from an enemy, but from the person who understood the law. Harper Givens's office sat high above the city, warm yellow light spilling over the streets like a gentle warning. Evan Cross sat across from her, hands resting on the dark wooden desk, back straight, eyes so calm they could be mistaken for indifference. Harper was not fooled. She had read thousands of divorces and hundreds of financial conspiracies, and she knew the moment a man crossed from emotion into decision. She opened a thick file, the soft rustle of pages sounding like wind slipping through a crack. She did not ask if Evan was sure. She asked how he wanted it to end, early and safe with everything split evenly, or all the way through where truth would demand its price. Evan did not answer at once. In his mind, he saw Sloane standing on stage lights, reflecting off her confident face. He thought of Maya being pushed out into the rain. He thought of Damien smiling in the penthouse. Then he spoke slowly, each word measured. He did not want fairness. He wanted precision. Harper nodded and turned to a page she had marked long ago, a clause most couples never truly read when they signed. The good faith provision, the rule against conspiring with a direct competitor to damage shared assets. Violate it, and claims could be forfeited immediately. No negotiation. No equal split. Evan looked at the language and understood. Sloane had not only betrayed him, she had placed herself in direct opposition to the very structure meant to protect her. Harper added the crucial point. To activate the clause, intent had to be proven. Not suspicion, not inference. A public act witnessed undeniable. Evan understood instantly. Sloane was preparing a performance. She wanted to end the marriage in public to control the narrative, and that stage would become the place where she accused herself. Harper laid out the plan. Do not file yet. Do not freeze accounts. Do not alert Damien. Let things continue a little longer. Let the money flow. Let the shell companies expand. Let confidence turn into carelessness. And above all, prepare everything so the counterstrike would land in the same moment. Evan signed a series of documents, not divorce papers, but structural changes. Assets were moved into a pre-existing trust, triggered by tight legal conditions. Joint accounts stayed open, but quiet limits were set. Nothing felt threatening. Everything looked normal. At the same time, Harper positioned the remaining pieces. A process server was placed on standby. Maya's file was reinforced, witness protections prepared. A regulatory complaint was drafted, waiting for the right second. Everything was silent but taut as a drawn wire. At home, Sloane noticed Evan becoming increasingly predictable. He did not question late meetings. He did not check her phone. He did not react when Damien's name came up. It made her confident. She began planning the upcoming gala like a director rehearsing a final act. Guest lists, press, lines practiced in her head. She wanted to leave in a blaze of light. Damien prepared in his own way. He believed the incoming capital would carry him through his rough patch. He saw Evan as a tamed resource smart, but lacking the instinct to fight a fatal misjudgment. That night, Evan returned home late. He stood in the dark watching Sloane sleep, her face peaceful, as if nothing were collapsing. In a rare moment, a deep and quiet sadness passed through him, not for what he was about to lose, but for what had once existed and could never return. He turned away. The conflict was set not with rage, but with rules, not with shouting, but with carefully prepared silence. And when the lights came on, when Sloane spoke before the crowd, Evan would not react. He would simply activate a clause and let the truth do the rest. The car rolled through the rain, and in 10 minutes there would be no turning back. Sloane stared at her phone screen while Evan looked into the darkness between two breaths, the place where truth waited to be called by name. The city slid past the windows like an old film reel. Streetlights stretched into long streaks, rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof. In the back seat, the air felt dense. Sloane vibrated with a strange energy, a blend of excitement and impatience. She checked her messages again, a string of short, confident lines commands before battle. Everything was ready. The press, the guests, the stage. She believed she was about to step into her final spotlight as the winner. Evan sat still, hands resting on his thighs, back straight, eyes fixed outside. In his mind, timelines aligned with precision. Accounts had been capped. The trust had been activated. The process server was in position. Witnesses were ready. He did not need to look at his phone. What he needed was to look at the woman beside him, to be certain she would not stop. Sloane broke the silence with a sharp tone, not a question, but a verdict. She said he always lived inside reports, inside numbers, inside fiscal quarters. She said he did not know how to enjoy a moment. She needed a life that was bigger, faster, more colorful. These lines had been rehearsed. Evan recognized the rhythm of a memorized script. He turned to look at her. Traffic lights washed over her perfectly made face, revealing a tiny tremor at the corner of her mouth. Evan spoke slowly, his voice so gentle it made Sloane hesitate. He said they did not have to go to this dinner. He said they could turn around, go home, order food talk, honestly. No stage, no audience. For a fragile instant, Sloane wavered. She looked at Evan as if at an unexpected exit appearing inside a maze. A part of her was tired of a role that had gone on too long. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down. A familiar name appeared. The hesitation vanished. Her expression hardened, confidence snapping back into place like a fitted mask. She let out a short laugh. She said he always needed to analyze everything until it suffocated her. She said she needed air. She needed people who understood her. She needed a crowd. And tonight, she would say everything out loud. Evan nodded. No argument, no pleading. In that moment, the last trace of pity left him like breath escaping his chest. The car slowed at the restaurant entrance. A valet opened the door. Cold rain rushed in. Sloane stepped out first, not waiting for Evan, her dress sweeping forward like a declaration of independence. In the lobby, Damien was already there, his smile wide, his eyes impatient. He leaned in to greet her, a possessive gesture no longer hidden. Sloane answered with a conspiratorial glance. Evan stepped out after them. He adjusted his cuff, fastened his jacket button, took a deep breath. The scent of the sea of metal, of endings. He looked up at the glowing restaurant sign. This was no longer a dinner. It was a courtroom. Inside, sound swelled. Laughter. Glasses clinking. Handshakes. Sloane slipped into the crowd like a fish into water, her smile blooming, her stories flowing. She played the role of a woman freeing herself, and the crowd was ready to applaud that narrative. Damien stood beside her, quietly absorbing admiration, convinced he stood at the center of a refined victory. Evan stayed a step back. He let people see him as they wished. A tired husband, a slow man, someone about to be left behind. No one noticed he was counting. Not money, but heartbeats, the rhythm of people about to indict themselves. When Sloane lifted her first glass, Evan knew the point of no return had been crossed. When she leaned close to whisper to Damien, he knew intent had been confirmed. When the stage lights grew brighter, he knew everything was in position. Evan did not need to do anything else. He only needed to sit and let silence accumulate, let their confidence swell until it could no longer hide. Beneath the laughter and music, an invisible gear had begun to turn. And when it finally closed, no one in that room would understand why the night ended so quickly. The microphone was switched on, and in a single breath, the entire room changed color. Not because of the lights, but because of a sentence that could never be taken back. Sloane stood at the center of the room, her shimmering dress catching the stage lights, her face radiant as if the night itself had been created for her. The music faded, scattered conversations died on their own, and every eye turned toward the smiling woman who had rehearsed this moment like a flawless debut. She held the microphone with a steady hand, shoulders open, the posture of someone who believed she controlled her own story. She began with familiar lines about the journey, about pressure, about how women must be strong to survive in rooms full of men. Each sentence was delivered with perfect timing, drawing nods of agreement from the crowd. Damien stood beside her, slightly angled toward the stage, his expression satisfied. He believed he was witnessing the final curtain of a marriage and the opening act of a new alliance. Sloane paused for a beat and took a deep breath. The smile on her lips shifted, becoming sharper and more resolute. This was the moment she had waited for. She spoke of relationships that no longer fit the woman she had become. She said stability could turn into chains. Then, in front of dozens of people, she turned and looked straight at Evan. "We are divorcing," she said clearly, without hesitation. No implication, no privacy. The word fell like a heavy object. The air thickened. A few sharp breaths were heard. Some eyes turned toward Evan with pity, others toward Damien with undisguised curiosity. Sloane noticed none of it. In her mind, the sentence was a full stop. She had forced everything into a public conclusion, convinced Evan would be unable to respond in time. Evan rose slowly. No rush, no hesitation. He adjusted his chair, set his glass down, and lifted his head. The stage lights caught his face, revealing a calm so unsettling that a chill passed through part of the room. No one understood why a man just publicly sentenced looked as though he were preparing to speak at a routine meeting. He did not grab the microphone. He did not argue. He spoke evenly, his low voice carrying across the room. He repeated. Then he turned to Damien, holding his gaze, just long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable. "Before we continue with that plural pronoun, I need to ask a question." Damien's lips twitched, ready to smile, but the expression died when Evan continued without changing his tone. "Did you tell her that your shell accounts are being reviewed for money laundering, or was that meant to be a surprise for the future?" The room exploded into silence, not with shouting, but with the collective collapse of expressions. Color drained from Damien's face, as if pulled out. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Sloane snapped her head toward Evan, eyes wide, shaking slightly, as if she had misheard. Evan placed a thin stack of papers on the nearest table. Not divorce documents. A financial investigation summary, its red seal, stark under the lights. He continued calmly, as though explaining a chart, the transfers, the intermediary vendors, the authorization signatures, and his wife's role in coordinating those flows. Sloane's breathing grew shallow. She said it was investment. She said Damien needed liquidity. Evan nodded, agreeing, then delivered the sentence that shattered everything. It was not investment. It was a bailout for a sinking ship, and you used my money to do it. Damien shot to his feet, his chair scraping hard against the floor. He accused Evan of entrapment. Evan did not look at him. He looked straight at Sloane. When you said we are divorcing, you confirmed the conspiracy in front of witnesses under the law. Sloane trembled. She searched the room for support. No one met her eyes. Friends looked away. Partners stared at the floor. The stage she had built had become a dock. Evan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He held something stronger than emotion. Truth delivered at the right moment, before the right people. And when he stepped back and returned the microphone to silence, the room finally understood something too late. Tonight was not the ending of a marriage. It was the public announcement of a verdict that had been prepared long ago. No one applauded. No one spoke. And it was that silence that struck like thunder, snapping the spine of those who had just believed themselves untouchable. After Evan's words, the room froze, as if sealed in glass. Damien remained standing, one hand gripping the edge of the table, his throat dry. He searched for an ally, a gaze to cling to someone to deny this with him. There was no one. The people who had smiled at him moments earlier now stared at their shoes, as if the floor had suddenly become more interesting than the truth unfolding above it. Sloane sat motionless, her shoulders dropped by the slightest degree, like the final support beam being pulled away. In her mind, every rehearsed script shattered. She had believed the stage would protect her, that lights and an audience could turn any statement into a favorable narrative. She did not understand that the law does not listen to background music. Evan did not press the attack. He did not need to. He opened the blue folder in front of him and turned the first page. The soft rustle of paper sounded louder than the music that had played before. He spoke slowly, his voice low, as if presenting in a familiar boardroom. Transfers began from joint accounts. They passed through intermediary vendors. They ended in shell companies directly connected to Damien. Each sentence drilled forward quiet, but penetrating. Damien tried to laugh. He called it a misunderstanding, an investment plan market risk. Evan nodded like a patient instructor. Risk was not the issue, he said. Intent was. And intent had been shown when Sloane coordinated the flows, when contracts were split, when signatures appeared at the right moments in the right places. Someone in the crowd swallowed hard. Another stepped back half a pace. Understanding spread slow and irreversible. This was not a marital argument. This was evidence being presented. Damien shifted to anger. He pointed, his voice rising, accusing Evan of entrapment, calling it a power game. Evan did not look at him. He looked at Sloane. The anger was gone from his eyes. What remained was fatigue. A trap exists only when greed steps into it, he said. No one forced you to sign. No one forced you to move the money. You chose. Sloane opened her mouth, then closed it. She wanted to say she had been misled, that Damien had promised her things, that she only wanted an escape. Every defense dissolved against the cold reality. She had acted. Publicly. Before witnesses. And the word, we had sealed everything. Evan turned to the final page. He did not read it aloud. He placed the document on the table and slid it towards Sloane. The good faith clause marked and explained in language that left no room for emotional interpretation. Conspiring with a direct competitor to damage shared assets. The consequence was forfeiture. Immediate. No one needed to read further. Everyone understood. A chair scraped the floor. Damien turned and headed for the exit. His tone already changed. He called it a family matter and said he should not be there. In a few short seconds, the man who had been arrogant moments before became a manager of damage ready to cut loose anything to survive. Sloane watched him go, eyes wide. In that instant, she understood the final truth. To Damien, she had never been a destination. She was a vehicle, and the vehicle had just lost its value. Evan stood. Not for effect, but because his part was finished. He adjusted his cuffs, fastened his jacket, every movement clean and precise, like closing a long meeting. A man in a gray suit approached and placed a thick envelope on the table. No introduction, no explanation. Sloane looked up, her voice breaking, asking what she should do. Evan looked at her one last time. There was no victory in his eyes, only an ending. He told her she would figure it out just as he had. When Evan turned and walked away, the room remained silent. But it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition. A game had ended not with an explosion, but with the cold precision of truth, delivered at the right moment, by the man everyone had underestimated the most. The news spread faster than the music that had just faded in that room. Before Sloane could even rise from her chair, the outside world had already begun to move cold and irreversible. The next morning, the city woke to cautious but cutting headlines. No names stated outright, only mentions of an expanding financial investigation of investment funds under scrutiny of suspicious transactions uncovered through an internal source. Damien Vale read those lines in his apartment while his coffee was still warm. His hand trembled just enough to spill a few drops onto the stone counter. He understood this language. When the press wrote like this, it meant the authorities were close. His phone began to vibrate. Lawyers, partners, people who once courted him now asked short, dry questions filled with suspicion. Damien answered with familiar reassurances, but his voice no longer held. He stepped to the window, staring down at the traffic below, trying to calculate an exit. With every call, the map in his mind shrank a little more. Across the city, Sloane sat inside the penthouse she once believed would launch her new life. Morning light poured through the glass walls, exposing the chaos left behind by the night before. She had not changed her clothes. Her makeup had smeared. On the table lay the thick envelope left by the man in the gray suit. She did not yet have the courage to open it. She knew what was inside. She simply wasn't ready to face how every one of her choices had been rewritten in legal language. Her phone buzzed as well, but not with the warm messages she once received. Questions, long silences, familiar names that no longer answered. She called Damien. The phone rang, then stopped. She called again. No answer. In that moment, a slow and brutal realization rose within her. She had been left behind not because of a romantic mistake, but because her value had become a liability. Meanwhile, Evan Cross walked into his office as if it were any other day. No reporters, no noise, just familiar corridors and employees who now looked at him differently. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect mixed with a vague fear. They sensed something had been protected, and that the price of crossing it was real. Evan sat down, opened his computer, and worked through his remaining emails. He did not follow the news. He did not need to. Everything was already in motion. Maya's file had been forwarded to the right place to the right people. The complaint had been activated in proper sequence. Witnesses were secured. The gears began to mesh, slow but certain. That afternoon, Evan's phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He answered. On the other end was a man with a precise voice identifying himself by official title. The investigation was progressing. Certain accounts had been frozen. Certain individuals were being summoned. Evan listened and replied calmly. When the call ended, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not in relief, but in exhaustion. Sloane finally opened the envelope. Pages slid out cold and heavy. Clauses, language, consequences listed without emotion. When she reached the section detailing immediate forfeiture of rights, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She sank to the floor, her back against the sofa, her breathing uneven. In her mind, old images flickered past. The day she first met Evan, quiet evenings, and the moment she chose the stage lights over silent truth. In another building, Damien stepped into his lawyer's office with a pale face. He no longer spoke of strategy. He asked about damage, about time, about whether any path existed that did not end in complete collapse. The lawyer did not answer directly. He simply said that when multiple streams of money converge, the attention of authorities is inevitable. Night fell. The city lights came on. Evan left his office late, walking without destination for a long stretch. He saw his reflection in the glass of passing buildings. A man still intact in wealth and reputation. Yet deep inside, one chapter of his life had closed completely. The legal battle was only beginning, but the emotional one had ended long ago. In that quiet, Evan understood this victory carried no applause. Only truth placed where it belonged, and those who chose the darkness would eventually face a light they could not control. The morning began with an empty house and ended with a truth that had nowhere left to hide. There were no screams, no shattered furniture, only light falling directly onto what had once been concealed. Evan Cross woke earlier than usual. The kitchen was so quiet that the sound of boiling water felt like a reminder. He brewed coffee out of old habit, then paused halfway through, realizing there was no longer anyone to place a second cup by the window for. Habits do not disappear instantly. They linger suspended like questions that no longer need answers. He stepped onto the balcony. The city below was starting its day. Traffic thickened, people hurried to work, believing everything was still intact. Evan looked down and understood that the world does not change for a private war. It simply continues, and sometimes that continuation is exactly what allows a person to stand upright again. In the days that followed, everything unfolded along the trajectory that had already been set. There were no pleading phone calls, no shadowy bargains, only formal letters, brief meetings, and dry signatures. Evan signed his name with a steady hand. He was not happy, but he was not hollow either. Emotion had passed through its loudest stage and left behind something more solid. Sloane's path was different. She moved out of the penthouse in silence. No press. No goodbyes. Each box carried away felt like a piece of life hastily packed up. She avoided other people's eyes not out of shame, but from fear of seeing her own reflection in them. At night she sat alone in a new apartment that was smaller and colder. She opened her phone, then shut it again. There was no one left to call in any real sense. Damien disappeared from parties. Names once tied to power quietly shifted away. Doors closed behind polite excuses. Relationships he thought were solid dissolved as quickly as they had been built. He learned an expensive lesson that ambition without restraint always leaves the throat exposed. Evan returned to work, but differently. He slowed down not out of fear, but because he had enough. He delegated placed trust where it belonged and kept long afternoon walks for himself without schedules. Some evenings he came home late, turned on the lights, then turned them off again, sitting in the dark for a moment. Not to dwell on regret, but to listen to the unfamiliar calm taking shape. One day he received a short email from Maya. She said thank you. No embellishment, no length. Just an acknowledgement that truth, when placed correctly, can save someone. Evan finished reading, closed his laptop, and allowed himself a very small smile. Not for victory, but because justice sometimes still arrives in time. Time moved on. The sharp edges softened. Questions no longer demanded answers. Evan understood that he could not recover what had been lost. Trust once broken does not fit back together the same way. But he had reclaimed something more important: the right to choose, the right to face truth without turning away. One quiet evening, Evan stood before the mirror, adjusted his collar, and noticed that his eyes had changed. No longer overly guarded, no longer shut tight, just a calm clarity. He knew he was not perfect. He knew he had loved the wrong person. But he also knew he had not betrayed himself. This story does not claim that silence always wins. It says that patience, when paired with preparation, can turn the underestimated into the one who holds the rules. It reminds us that the stage can blind, but truth does not need spotlights. It only needs timing. And if you are listening to this now, ask yourself one thing. When truth stands in front of you, will you turn away, or will you stand your ground? If this story made you think, leave a comment and share your perspective. If you found it valuable, press like to help it reach others. And if you want to keep following stories where the underestimated turn the tables, subscribe. We will meet again in the next story.